retire in 2008. And second, by July 2008, David Cameron and Andrew Lansley had published their now famous Autonomy and Accountability White Paper on the NHS. But no one at all, including, I think, even them, foresaw quite what would happen once that white paper was stuck into the hands of a coalition government. No one back in 2008 foresaw the Health and Social Care Act in all its stupendous glory. So do remember, things do and doubtless will happen, both for good and for ill, that no one now can quite foresee, which, given what we can foresee, might even be a comfort. Thank you.
So thank you, Nick. So now we've had our appetites whetted. I'm going to now ask the panellists to speak for about 5 minutes each, and I'm going to kick off with Raymond Tallis, who is physician, philosopher, polymath extraordinaire, and former geriatrician in the Northwest. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The exam question is NHS at 65, rejuvenate or retire? But I think before we can even begin to answer this question, and indeed the related questions of affordability, adaptability, entitlement and social justice and so on, I think we need a bit of context. Nick has given us some of the context, but I want to look at it a little bit differently. I want to look back to 2010, when the NHS was 62 years old and appeared in relatively good health. It was recording the highest levels of patient satisfaction, treatment was more accessible as well as effective than it had been before, waiting lists were down, and so on. And this is in part a response to increased resources that have gone some way to correct a historic underfunding, still at present only just below 10% compared with just under 12% in France and just under 12% in Germany. A Commonwealth Fund report on healthcare in 7 industrialised countries placed the NHS high on quality, efficacy and access to care, and at the top, above Netherlands and Australia on efficiency. And all of this had been achieved in the face of endless top-down disorganisations driven by mandarins and politicians whose simplistic views of the complexities of healthcare reflected breathtaking arrogance and a terrifying distance from clinical reality. Because all major parties promised to... You know who you are. Because all major parties promised to stop meddling and end the 20-year tradition of politician knows best, things looked fair to meet the long-standing challenges of the NHS, and some new challenges emerging in 2010. Now, at this stage, there's a challenge to make sure this machine works. Yep. The problems are well known, and Nick's alluded to them, but they're perhaps not as great as feared. An ageing population and increasing expectation of health and healthcare, more complex medicine and so on, and consequently increased demands on the NHS. But that's not new. Demand has always threatened to outstrip resources, and old age, by the way, and I speak as a geriatrician, doesn't necessarily translate into an increased health burden. There was a need to overcome obstacles to integrating hospital and community services and health and social care. This would ensure, for example, that people who didn't need to be in hospital wouldn't be admitted, or once admitted, wouldn't stay a day longer than necessary. There were, of course, other problems, and some of them very serious, and some of them more apparent now than they were then. And the most serious was the decline in the standard of nursing care and common humanity in certain parts of the service. These would need to be dealt with urgently, in a manner based on the diagnosis of underlying causes. They included local factors, such as a bullying target culture derived from the top, the aping of private sector disciplines and private sector values, the marginalisation of professionals, and perhaps wider trends in society that valued hands-on care very little. So, what the NHS needed at the age of 62 was stability, more efficient working to get greater health gains out of allocated resources, closer cooperation between its parts, better integration of health and social services, a culture of innovation and candour, and increasingly efficient working driven by professionals committed to the ethos of public service. What the NHS got was the mother of all disorganisations and broken promises, enshrined in a bill that passed into law that Nick's referred to in March 2012. It was as unexpected as a block of frozen urine from a 747. Lansley's Health and Social Care Act brought to completion a process of marketisation pushed forward without political mandate by all 3 parties. It was, as you see on the slide, effectively a suppository made out of Semsex inserted into the rear end of the NHS. Like many such devices, it had a difficult passage, but it got there in the end as a result of a lot of lying, lobbying and arm twisting. So, what the NHS got was destabilisation driven by the enemy of cooperation, untrammeled competition, with the threat of total disintegration of care, not to speak of hugely expensive and time-wasting tendering processes in which predatory providers would slug it out for a share of the action. Their primary responsibility, of course, is not the health of the nation, but the health of the balance sheet. As for the culture of candour, will private companies want to share their data? What about reputational risk? Where's your money going? What about commercial confidentiality? This new Act will further marginalise professionals who had already become overmanaged sessional functionaries and now are about to be turned into loyal company men and women. Patients will have absolutely no voice. But of course the Act distances the Secretary of State of Health from the chaos that will result. No wonder the Act was welcomed by so many politicians. So the future of the NHS at the moment looks very bleak, unless we fight an ideologically driven act of destruction made possible by individuals with vested interests in private healthcare. And this can be done without further redisorganisation. If we do, then I'm optimistic that the NHS will be able to face the challenges of the future. If we don't, we'll end up with less for more, Skid Row services to the underinsured, and we'll move towards an inequitable, wasteful US-style service which spends 18% of its GDP serving its population very badly. To put it bluntly, if we fail to deal with the toxic cocktail of cuts, redisorganisation and privatisation, and many people will die as a result, many more will suffer from inadequate treatment, and vast numbers will face financial ruin. So what I would put to you as a sort of context for our debate is the choice is yours. An NHS that is retired, or more strictly liquidated, and one that is rejuvenated. If we slay Lansley's monster, we can start to think seriously about the ways we can meet the great but not insuperable challenges that face the NHS, and think about affordability, adaptability, entitlement, and social justice. Thank you.
So, Raymond, you fell short of saying that your prescription was Semtex suppositories for the politicians, but I guess you were almost leading on to that point.
I'm a merciful man.
Thank you. At which point I will turn to Alan Milburn, who needs no introduction, former Secretary of State for Health and Chair of the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. And Alan, breathtaking arrogance, was that the reason for problems we face?
So you've had an interesting experiment. Okay, because for 20 or 30 years, I've heard a continual argument in the National Health Service that everything would be great without politics. And that's what you've just had. You've had the least political Secretary of State in the NHS's history. And this is what happens, my friends, without politics and belief and values. And that's why it's all gone wrong. Okay? Now, what is interesting about the debate, and Nick alluded to this in his introduction. The NHS has been in remarkably good health for 65 years, but in truth, throughout those 65 years, there have been periodic phases of profound doubt about its sustainability. And I fear that as a consequence of what has happened during the last few years, we are about to enter just such another phase. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, as it has faced this tsunami of doubt, which has reoccurred approximately every 10, 11 or 12 years, if you chart the history, Birmingham babies, Bristol babies, winter of 98, 99, and now mid-staffs and so on and so forth. The NHS has been able to withstand the challenges in the past, and I'm pretty confident that it will be able to withstand the challenges in the future. But I say that with two caveats. Okay? Caveat one is the characteristic that has ensured survival and prosperity for the NHS is not conservatism, but it's change. The National Health Service has continually changed, and it will need to continually change and adapt in the future. And the second caveat, in my view, is this, that all too often when we're talking, and Nick's language partially spoke of this, when we're talking about these issues, that are confronting our system of care, all too often the language that we use is the language of challenge, when I actually believe it should be the language of opportunity. I believe that the opportunity exists to create a better, fairer system of care than we have today. And I know that that sounds unusual in the circumstances that we now find ourselves in, but I want to explain why it is. So let us just think about the 2 or 3 things that people always say are going to overwhelm the National Health Service and sweep it away. First of all, old age. It is true, we live in an ageing society. Within 20 years, 20% of the population will be very elderly. But this is not old age as we've known it. There will be more very old people living with more health problems, comorbidity, than we've ever seen before. The challenge is to find a way of producing seamless care from a system that is today more fragmented than it is cohesive. The opportunity, as we drive health and social care together, which is what will happen in the years to come, is to drive out the inefficiencies, both clinically and financially, that arise from different management systems, different information systems, different management teams, different accountabilities, different budgets, and different timelines. That is an opportunity and not a challenge. The second challenge that people say will overwhelm the National Health Service is the challenge of chronic disease. And it is true, 75% of today's National Health Service budget goes on treating the ravages of chronic disease. And we know that we ain't seen nothing yet. Diabetes prevalence worldwide, for example, amongst adults, will rise by around 50% during the next 25 years. Interestingly, however, that change in the incidence of disease is also changing the debate on healthcare, from one that has primarily been about the state of each nation's healthcare to instead being where it should be, which is about the state of each nation's health. The focus, if you like, is moving, and will continue to do so, from treatment to prevention. If you have diabetes or arthritis, it is with you 24/7. So what you as a patient do, in terms of the exercise you take, the lifestyle you choose, the diet that you consume, becomes as important as anything that a clinician does. The challenge is to find ways of treating patients less as passive recipients of care in a system, if we're honest, that all too often denies them power and responsibility, and instead finding new ways of making them more responsible for their own health. The opportunity, in my view, is to harness the modern citizen and patient's desire, their appetite for control and for knowledge. The ability exists to give them the information and the budgets and the control so that the public become insiders, not outsiders in health. The third big challenge that people say is technology. From schizophrenia drugs in the 50s, to hip replacements in the 60s, to organ transplants, to HIV, technology was always going to overwhelm the NHS, and the NHS has always proved the doubters wrong. Technology can drive cost up, but it can also drive cost down. It is possible that in our lifetimes, if we can harness the benefits of the Human Genome Project, pharmacogenetics can translate the benefits of that research into medicines capable not only of beating genetic disease, but of tailoring individual drugs to meet the needs of the individual patient. And if that happens, our whole paradigm, expensive paradigm of healthcare, of first detecting illness and then treating it, will change to one instead that is about predicting and then preventing ill health. And in the short term, the rising tide of chronic disease will drive the focus still harder away from episodic treatment, largely in hospital, the most expensive part of the system, first into the community, and then, as telemedicine and telecare evolves, into people's homes. The challenge is to find ways of changing how we engineer our services so they're less dependent on hospitals and they're better capable of meeting needs in the community. The opportunity is to harness the new technologies of mobile health, telecare, telemedicine, IT, health records that patients control, to enable us to do just that. And the final challenge that people talk about and that I want to address is money. We are living in straitened times. In 1960, across the OECD, the developed economies were spending about 4% of GDP on healthcare. Today, we're spending 10%. Okay? Our economies have been growing like that, and healthcare budgets are being growing like that. Now, I don't know whether every cloud does have a silver lining, but the one benefit of the global financial crisis is that it has brought those good times to a shuddering halt. The new holy grail in healthcare policy is how do we get more out for what we put in? Okay? And this is where I'm optimistic. Okay? If I look at any other industry in the world, and to be honest, healthcare is another industry. That's what it is. It's an industry that cares and treats and looks after people, but it's another industry. Improvements in quality have been matched not by increases in cost, but by reductions in cost. Think of the price and quality of a car or a computer or a cell phone. Quality has gone up, prices have come down, but not in healthcare. Doing more with less and doing it better, cheaper, faster is the new normal. That is how modern industries work. The opportunity is to go with the current fiscal constraints and to do what needs to be done, which is to deliver a system of care, not that is changed in terms of the system of funding, but is changed in the system of delivery, so that we better optimize resources, we better improve outcomes, and most importantly of all, we better empower patients. And those, my friends, are reasons to be confident and not unconfident. The NHS has done it before, and I profoundly believe that we will do it again. Thank you very much.
So, Alan, if I'm allowed one question, because I imagine if Andrew Lansley was sitting on the front row here, I think he'd be nodding to practically everything you said.
God, what an awful thought.
So the question, can I just put you a quick question? And that is, will the reforms that are now being implemented help or hinder those areas that you were talking about effectively, which are about efficiency, in a sentence?
They will. Some things will be beneficial and some things won't. Okay. Overwhelmingly, my sense is that, you know, when I talk to people in the system, I did an event the other day with a group of 50 or 60 managers, and they were asking me lots of questions about health and politics and so on and so forth. And at the end, I asked if I could ask them a question. Okay. And I asked them, what did they think they were supposed to be doing? And what you've just done is what they did. There was total silence. I've never known a time when there has been more chaos, more confusion, more uncertainty about what the National Health Service should be doing. These, my friends, have been 5 wasted years, okay? Because that's what we're about to have. Now, does that mean that elements of these reforms are all wrong? No, it doesn't. Because there are some things that, if you apply the industry analogy, applies to healthcare just like any other industry. Empowered consumers, we call them patients. Okay? Some choice and some contestability. Monopolies don't work in any form of life, whether public or private. Okay? They're not characterized by either operational efficiency or customer responsiveness. Okay? Autonomy, so that organizations feel as if they're in charge, rather than, as Raymond was saying, the politicians being in charge. These are universal drivers of improvement. And some of them, not all of them, are captured both in the previous Labour government's reforms and, in some ways, have been continued by this government. Now, the overall reform package, I'm afraid, has induced chaos rather than order, but it doesn't mean that some of the direction of travel is wrong.
Okay, thank you. So, Shirley Williams, Baroness Williams, I'd like to introduce now, well known to all of you, I think, here. Currently,
say where I am?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I should begin by saying that 2 things, really. The first is that I don't myself believe the National Health Service is, the analogy with it as an industry is quite right. I I'm very interested in some of the things that Alan said, but I think that there is, and has always been, an assumption that both the motivation that takes people into health, whether it's as clinical consultants or as nurses, is not the same as it would be if they were in the motor industry. That's why we keep fussing so much about the quality of care. It's why mid-staffs emerged as a real major national scandal, because the assumption was, it may not be a fair assumption, but the assumption was that in the NHS there was a degree of commitment and dedication to the concerns and interests of the patient that would not be the same if you were looking at trying to sell a Lada car to a customer. It was a different style of approach. And I say for myself that I think the NHS should remain a public service and not be seen as another kind of industry, which is very much what my experience, a long experience in the United States, has been. That is to say, to see health as an industry, and one with a much greater interest in these customers that can afford to pay substantially than in customers that can't afford to pay substantially, and that's not meant to be the driving ethic of the NHS. Now, having said that, let me also say that I don't entirely agree with the professor, because I think he's taken an easy doctrinal difference of opinion in a situation where the actual characteristics, the objective characteristics we have to deal with, are not ones one can simply deal with by a doctrinaire statement about going back to the NHS as it was. Like it or not, we are faced with huge needs for change, and I agree very much here with what Alan said. And those changes are responsive to the changes in our society, not to the arguments about whether there should be a private or a public service. They will affect both, I think, very seriously. My own view is that they can't be well handled by a private service. Now, let's look at them very quickly. Number one, you can get any order you like, I completely agree with what's been said by both the Professor and Alan, that we have to look at probably an integrated budget to cover the difference between social care and medical care, and we're nowhere near it. You will have noticed in the last few days that what happened when it was announced by the government that there would be ring fencing of NHS expenditure, which meant that it would decline by the level of inflation, but not more. At the same time, the actual resources for local authorities went down by, in most cases, around 10%. Now, what that means is that the vision put before us all of an integrated health service, and I passionately agree with that, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. One of the saddest places I ever go to is a geriatric ward, which is exactly the wrong way to grow old and die, as distinct from community care, hospices, and all the rest of it. I mean, it's itself a death sentence to go into a geriatric ward in a big hospital, because that's not what they're for. If you're going to address that, then we have to face up to the fact that we're going to have to shift even some of the desperately straitened resources we already have in health to local authorities to do their part of it. One of the reasons why the A&E clinics are at the moment flooded out is because we've got the sequencing badly wrong. We started the sequencing by changing the hospitals, but we haven't provided the social care that is meant to wrap round the hospitals to provide people with the care that they need. And what that means is that very sensibly, the public is bypassing the non-existent or very weak local authority structure and going straight to A&E, which is exactly where, from the point of view of economics, they should not be. There are something like, as you know, something like 30% of people who show up at A&E who have no reason to be there at all, except that they simply think waiting 4 hours for a proper doctor is a better deal than waiting half an hour for somebody who's going to be probably at best a health assistant. The second thing does fit in very well with something that Alan did say, and that was the absolutely key fact that the health service has been hit by its own success. Why are so many people with chronic illnesses living so much longer, well into the 60s and 70s and even the 80s? And the answer is partly because the NHS has been so damn good in the past. But we're now living with the outcome of that success. And the outcome of that success is a tremendously heavy burden, not only on the health service, but generally, of people with different and often multiple chronic illnesses. What does that lead me to say? That we have to essentially outsource a great deal of the health care that we give. And to give you one example, no time for more than one, It means that we have to, for example, recognise the qualifications of pharmacists and, in my view, put everybody with a long chronic condition registered with a pharmacist as well as a GP, with a pharmacist essentially responsible for the drug regime and how it's handled and how it's dealt with and how it's looked after when something goes wrong, because, frankly, pharmacists know more about that than GPs do. And yet, because of some kind of superiority, and forgive me for saying it if you're a doctor, a kind of medical hierarchy, which means the pharmacist is an able seaman, and it's really the clinical consultant who's the captain, we don't take anything like reasonable resources in the assistance in the professions associated with medicine. I mentioned pharmacy, I could have mentioned physiotherapy and many others, in the way that we absolutely have to do if we're going to provide this outside help. Just a couple of other things. The attitude towards nurses, I think, is crackers. We don't train health assistants. More and more work is being done, not even by nurses, but by health assistants. And so when we complain about care, we often complain about people with virtually no training at all in how to provide care, however good and big their hearts may be. And we've got to, again, I'm sorry to say, I put that down partly to the hierarchical attitudes in medicine. The fact that a nurse is something lower than a consultant, and a health assistant isn't lower than a nurse. And so the burden of care is carried by people who are not actually highly respected within the profession itself. And that's very dangerous, and I think very unfortunate. And I think we're paying the price for that with places like Midstaffs, and the last Midstaffs in turn has fed out into other scandals of this kind, which incidentally will do much more damage to the health service than virtually any ideological attack you can think of. I'll conclude finally by saying that, I'm sorry, I've got to touch on the terrible issue of GPs. GPs are critical to the NHS as it currently stands. But we all know there's a huge crisis about GPs. What is the nature of that crisis? Well, part of it really honestly is that stupid contract that was entered into 10 years ago or 8 years ago. Because there should always have been a responsibility resting on GPs, and all the more now. Because if you have clinical groups, which we've got out as one of the, well, incidentally, I have to say, one of the most surviving aspects of the Health and Social Care Act, because despite what the professor said, many parts of it have been quite fundamentally altered, including competition. But not when it comes to the CCGs, they're all there. But the price of being a CCG and having the additional autonomy that's gone to you has got to be complete 24-hour, 27 days a week responsibility for your patients. You don't have to do it yourself, but you absolutely have to be the person where the buck stops. And that's something I think I need to say, finish by saying, I think GPs have got to take responsibility for the whole of their patient set. And that means in hours, out of hours, wherever it may be, we've got to live with the world we live in, which is a 24/7 world, and not an 8 hours a day, 4 days a week world. And that means that the government of the day, or the future government of the day, has got to, I think, get into a new kind of contract relationship with GPs and think very hard about what the role of GPs ought to be.
Thank you very much, Shirley. We are going to have a discussion later, but you mentioned at the beginning about the importance of integration, particularly across health and social care, and I wondered whether you could just say a little bit about where you thought the role of competition was within that. If we have to integrate because to meet the challenge of complex, frail older people, conditions, what role is there for more contestability in healthcare, which Alan was talking about?
Yes, he was. I don't know what they think. They're both more expert than I am, because my own view is that there's actually almost everything is going to depend on whether a CCG is well advised and by whom. And I was pleased to see that the National Commissioning Board, prior to the disappearance of its chairman, was beginning to offer help and assistance to CCGs that were dealing with the contracts they were making. Bluntly, if you have a CCG which is sophisticated and knows what it's doing, you can retain a very large part of the NHS structure. It means wrapping everything up together rather than fragmenting it into different bits and then contracting different bits out to different suppliers, because most suppliers, private suppliers, cannot provide a cohesive service, and the NHS can. However, At the moment, I think a great deal depends upon whether there are CCGs that are A, responsive to that. I've met some which are. For example, one in Brighton is doing a brilliant work of integrating the way it treats its patients, and then, as it were, offering the integrated service to those who are prepared to act as suppliers to it. And that really means you keep a very great deal of the ethos of the NHS. But you could also fragment into nothing but lots of little bits of private supplier, and that means you're giving a gift, if you like, to private suppliers of a kind that's going to be fragmenting, and that's perfectly true.
Thank you very much. Stephen Dorrell, reforms a fine mess.
I follow Shirley's lead and stay seated. I want to respond, if I may, as directly as I can to Raymond's challenge to the political class, essentially, that the health service has been the responsibility of people who've preferred very often to make political and ideological points rather than get on with the process of delivering a set of political ideas that are actually broadly shared. It's one of the secrets that the political class keeps to itself, doesn't allow out into the world outside for fear of the trouble that it might cause, that actually across the House of Commons, and in that sense the House of Commons reflects the electorate, there is a broad sign-up to the idea of the National Health Service, the idea that health and care should be available to those who need it without regard to ability to pay. That simple proposition has been the subject of virtually unanimous political support since the end of the last war. We don't need to go back into the prehistory. My problem with the way Raymond presented his case is that I think he then fell into his own trap, because he elaborated a very clear political message in the way the politicians like to do, without looking at the fundamental consistency that's prevailed across in health policy, at the very least since 1990. I voted for the Lansley Act, but in doing so, I always said that it seems to me the arguments both for and against the Act were grossly overstated on both sides. What the Lansley Act did was to make some significant but not fundamental changes to reforms that came in when Ken Clarke introduced purchaser provider in 1990, and when the gentleman sat on my right re-legislated that idea in 2002, and Andrew Lansley re-legislated again in 2012. The principle that taxpayer funds, that the politicians who collect the taxes are accountable for the way that tax revenue is used, and their success in delivering the basic idea around which the health service is built, that is to say, healthcare available on the basis of need, not ability to pay. The principle of purchaser provider is simply intended to make that accountability more effective and more transparent. And that's something that's been the subject of party political consensus since at least 1990. Now, so much for the area of agreement. So we're asked to consider National Health Service, rejuvenate or retire. I want to offer 3 words to you to crystallize my answer to that question. First word, strategy. It seems to me it flows from everything that I've said, that the objective that we're seeking to deliver, care available on the basis of need without regard to ability to pay, that is the subject of virtually unanimous political consent, both within the political class and among those who we seek to represent. So first tick in a box. Strategy, we're all on the same page. Structure, that's where we come to trouble, because politicians love talking about structure without asking themselves what is the strategy that structure is supposed to deliver. Is the National Health Service the idea that I've described, care available on the basis of need, not ability to pay? Is that what the National Health Service is about? Or is it a set of structures that grew up in the 1940s. I'm totally committed to the idea. What I'd offer you is the thought that the structures, for example, that invite us to believe that there is a difference between primary healthcare and community healthcare, that there's a divide that must always define a distinction between primary health, community health, and social care, that none of those three activities, all in separate silos, should share information with social housing, where a significant number of the users of social care and primary healthcare services live, and where they the first people who have access to the information Alan talks about in order to identify emerging need and prevent it becoming acute. So these different elements of the community-based services, we've inherited a set of structures that weren't even planned in 1948. One of the most fundamental distinctions, the distinction between the hospital community-based service, secondary care as we describe it, and primary care, wasn't the result of a political choice. It was a fix, a deal done by Nye Bevan with the BMA in 1948, and still we live with the consequences. If we're serious about the strategy, the ideal for which we venerate the National Health Service, the reason why Nigel Lawson famously described it as the nearest thing we have to an established church, shouldn't we be a little more critical sometimes of the means by which we seek to deliver those ideals that we all sign up to? So I'm up for the strategy, but I'm with Alan on the need to accept change in the structures that deliver the strategy. Now, that shouldn't come as a surprise. There's an interesting debate going on between Alan on my right, literally in this respect, and Shirley on my left, literally in this respect. Is it an industry or is it a public service? I'm a non-combatant. What I'm absolutely clear about is that health and care delivery is the purest form of wealth creation that there is. If the word wealth means anything, surely it means our ability to exploit modern technology to enjoy a longer but healthier life. The health economists love talking about QALYs. Very often we talk about QALYs as if they were alleys. I'm in favour of a QALY, and I'm in favour of a set of structures which are designed for the purpose of using modern technology, using the skills of the workforce to better deliver the objective of additional QALYs. So I said there were three words I wanted you to think about. Strategy, I've made clear what I think the strategy is. Structure, I'm very clear the structures are not fit for purpose and need to be changed. That's where the integration comes in. The third word I want you to think about is people, and I've put them very deliberately in that order. If you want to deliver a set of objectives, whether you're talking, Shirley, about running a car company or a healthcare system, you need to go through that decision tree. First, your strategy. Second, the structures to deliver your strategy. And third, a set of policies and processes which will ensure that the structures you build have available to them the human skills. In particular, of course, this is true in the delivery of a personalized health and care system, a set of ensure that you attach the right priority to attracting, retaining, and motivating real skilled people with the skills accurately attuned to the strategy and the structure you're seeking to deliver. So my answer to to NHS rejuvenate or retire is very definitely not retire, because the strategy everybody signs up to. But rejuvenate by addressing the structures which are not fit for purpose, and being orders of magnitude better at respecting the motivation of the people who deliver these services, which is where I'm wholeheartedly on the side of Raymond, who Shirley refers to as the professor. Motivating and respecting the people who deliver the service rather than engaging in a completely abstract political argument. If we can get the politicians onto that square, we'll be making a huge amount of progress. And Professor, I look forward to joining you joining me in that process.
So, Stephen, can I ask one thing while I'm in the chair? Health, if you look across the Western world, you see very similar developments that are happening in health systems. You must see this, Alan, as you go around the world. We're all trying to do the same thing, and we're all trying the same kind of tools and so on. But we haven't got the luxury of thinking about long-term development at the moment. We've got some very severe short-term financial shocks. So given that you're on the chair of the Select Committee, you kind of see interesting ideas coming in and out of the committee all the time. What are your top few suggestions? What are the best things that you've seen recently about how to deal with these financial shocks that we're facing now?
Well, I think the answer to that is the answer that I give in truth to private sector people when they ask us, does the private sector have a role to play in this? I would argue yes. And to anyone in the public sector who's interested in thinking how the system needs to change, is don't wait for some strategy to emerge from Richmond House. Find a problem and solve it. Seek forgiveness, not permission. Because if in truth, within the health and care community, as Nick started off by saying, there's a very broad measure of agreement about how structures need to evolve. The last thing we need is another piece of legislation that has a go at writing it all up from scratch again. Find a problem and solve it. And if you identify within, and it's not difficult to find in local health economies, areas where these ideas put into practice, don't say they solve all the problems, but they relieve pressures, they deliver better quality care at better value. And the curse of this whole world is the belief that in Richmond House we're just waiting for the perfect solution to emerge from Richmond House. We know what the solution looks like in broad outline. You apply those ideas to problems in the system, and that develops a momentum which is divorced from the kind of political argument the Professor and I don't think adds much value.
Thank you. Polly Toynbee to my right, the must-read journalist of The Guardian. Many thanks for joining us, your contribution.
Thank you very much. Well, just a few thoughts. It does seem to me that the NHS is teetering on the edge in a way that it hasn't. I mean, as Nick said, we're a crisis, there are ups and downs, but I think what we're facing now is really pretty serious. And in a way, what matters, what's going to be important is who and what gets the blame. What's the analysis if there really is a crisis over the next 2 or 3 years? Well, lack of money. There never has been such a squeeze, and Stephen Dorrell has been the one who flagged this up most passionately right from the beginning, saying, you know, the NHS has never had 4 years, let alone now 5, 6 years of zero spending, and as he pointed out, it's always fallen over every time it's dipped below about 2%. Its average has been, on the whole, near what it needs is 4% in order to keep up with the extra added inflation. So it is a real crisis. Or will the redisorganisation, your nice word, and Alan Maynard's, get the blame? Will people say, well, at this time when it was going to be so hard anyway, the last thing it needed was £3 billion taken out to reorganise it, complete restructuring, dismantling. 90,000 people changed their jobs, apart from the ones who lost it, and all the senior managers who left in disgust because they'd been reorganised so many times. 90,000 people changed their jobs, and that is a huge loss of productivity in terms of people moving about. Or will it be something that there are many people on the right who will seize on, many people in the Conservative Party who will seize on and say, don't waste a good crisis. This shows that there is something intrinsically wrong with the NHS pattern. We've always said so. You've only got to listen to people like Reform or the Free Enterprise group of young Turks of MPs, or indeed David Law's, the Liberal Democrat in the Orange Book, saying, you know, it could never work, or for 65 years it somehow has, but that's just been a miracle. We know there's something profoundly wrong with the model, and there'll be a lot of people trying to put the blame there. But I would like, before I go on, to strongly recommend this book of which Raymond has edited, which absolutely tells it like it is by a number of different experts about what the NHS faces at the moment. It's a terrific read and a very good story about how the Lansley reorganisation happened. And I think it brings out some of the real problems that CCGs are compelled to put everything out to tender, except if they can absolutely prove in law that there was only one possible provider. That puts enormous pressure on them. There will be big legal costs, enormous administrative costs. It's very expensive to put things out to tender. Every single little thing being put out to tender. Who is counting that administrative cost? I hope that research is being done by the health economists. Private providers are already galloping ahead. I very much enjoy, with certain horror, reading the Health Investors Journal, which is well worth reading. It's quite expensive to subscribe to. You can see a little bit on the internet, enough to see the glee with which the private sector is galloping in to take up things. Indeed, exactly as Mark Britnell, who I fear may be about to take over from David Nicholson, said, the NHS will be shown no mercy. The NHS will become an insurance provider, not a deliverer. And that seems to be what a lot of these private providers think, and they are moving in very fast. Meanwhile, private beds are taking up a larger and larger part of the NHS. If you look at the business plans of foundation trusts, they are all factoring in quite a large increase in the amount of their beds that are used by the private sector. And that's partly because waiting lists go up, more people go back into into buying health privately, and the balance tips. And as we know, it can go up to 49%. I mean, that's unlikely in most respects, but it doesn't take very much to tip the balance in terms of waiting lists going up and more people choosing the private sector. The chaotic organogram of this new system really defies any belief. I should have brought there are wonderful pictures of the spaghetti junctions of how all this works. But I think we're already seeing, just to take one example, that CCGs are not capable in the main of actually doing the commissioning themselves. So they have to hire CSUs, support units, to do it for it. Now it turns out the support units themselves are collapsing, and a lot of them are not fit for purpose. And they're mostly in the private sector and have to be privatised if they're not already. And that's just one small example of the amount of chaos that's going under the surface. The trouble is, it's not very well reported because it's so difficult to understand and so complicated that most journalists give up and most news editors glaze over if anyone offers them stories about this. Nevertheless, the pressure on GPs, pressure on A&E, nearly 99%, sometimes 100% bed occupancy, which is a dangerous rate to be running at in most hospitals. I think there's real danger that now the Secretary of State is no longer responsible, no longer the provider of the NHS. You see Jeremy Hunt very much taking this to heart and stepping back and becoming the critic of the NHS on the sidelines. I'm on the side of the patients against the NHS, leaving this sense that nobody's really in control. There are a lot of received opinions and bien-pensant ideas which we can all agree with here, that we need smaller specialist hospitals, fewer beds. We need much more care in the community, all the things that everybody's talked about, but it's not at all clear how. Who gives you the bridging loan to do that? At a time when community services have been cut by 20%, the community care, by the councils who are themselves under such pressure. How do you get from here to there? How do you get those diabetic nurses when diabetic nurses in the community are being seriously cut back? How do you do that? And it isn't plain. Everybody knows what the ends should be, but not at all how to get there. And certainly the Dilnot proposals at this point to take more money out of social care and have the state pay more so that people protect their inheritances seems a very odd time to be going into that one. Everybody's in favour of patients taking more responsibility, but they do need help. The other thing is people say, well, how wonderful transparency is. It'll make everybody feel much better about the NHS. It won't. It'll make people feel worse. It is transparency that revealed the Mid Staffordshire, the Morecambe Bay. These things have probably been going on and probably still are going on since the dawn of time. The idea that there was a time when it was all wonderful, when Hattie Jakes ran everything and it was just terrific. Actually, those Hattie Jakes matrons were mostly monsters, and that was pretty cruel and unkind treatment, certainly in children's wards, maternity wards. You know, it wasn't all wonderful back then, and I'm very doubtful as to whether the NHS is less caring now than it was, but we see an awful lot more of it, and we will more too, particularly if the CQC does get beefed up, and it'll be even more anxious to expose everything it can. It will undermine faith in the NHS. It won't shore it up. What we find about transparency right across the board, which is rather depressing because we're all in favour of transparency, but it doesn't engender trust on the whole. Politicians always want to reorganise. Let's hope Labour doesn't. They do need to change the system, to take the competition out of it, to take the motor that is fragmenting it, or the hand grenade that's exploding it. They need to take that out of the system, but I do hope that they will resist moving all the deck chairs again. To be done, well, I think GPs are the next thing that has to be, and I think that Darcy had the right idea with polyclinics, getting GPs to work together collaboratively in an intermediate sector. But that costs money. I think that's the final thing, is about money. You have to tell the truth. You can't have more for less. You can go on being as efficient as you can, reconfiguring, doing what you can, rejuvenating. But basically, the fact is you basically get what you pay for. And somebody's got to be honest with the voters. And they care about the health service more than anything else. And I think you have to have hypothecated taxes, and taxes people understand. And then I think they will back the idea that they will have to pay more for their health if they want it to be as good as they do, and their expectations go on rising. And the one big thing everybody knows is that any other way of paying for it is worse. It's just a question of how much. The idea of co-payments, which Reform and all those other people have been going for, they wanted it in good times, they want it more in bad times, are the answer. We know it's not. We know it leads towards an Americanized system where everybody ends up paying more for less. And so I think honesty about money is what we need from politicians. Will we get it? Probably not.
So, Polly, can I just ask one thing before I hand over to Matthew here? And that is, do you think there's any place for competition bringing in private providers of clinical care? I mean, would you really rather see none at all? It's about 8% at the moment of NHS funds go on the private or voluntary sector.
Well, I don't think you can say none at all, because obviously all sorts of odds and ends. You know, the NHS is a huge and baggy organisation, and you know, the NHS never manufactured its own beds or manufactured its own drugs, all sorts of bits of it, for historical reasons. And I didn't think it was such a bad idea to ginger up, when there were long waiting lists, to bring in independent treatment centres that came in as kind of exocets to really cut consultants' long waiting times. And it did. I can remember going around, I think it might have been with Alan. We went to an ophthalmologist, went to Peterborough, and we met very angry ophthalmologists who were furious because an ITC had been put there and their waiting lists had simply vanished and the whole of their private practice had gone, and they were outraged. And actually, I think that was the right thing to do. I don't think Labour could have got waiting lists down to zero. That may be the last time we ever see that, but I don't think they could have done without some of that. Though most of those ITCs were actually NHS run. I mean, it was just a method rather than who provided it. It turned out that the ones who provided it privately ended up being much more expensive. They needed huge guarantees to move in there, and they weren't very economical. But in principle, that kind of thing, if you suddenly see a reason why you could bring somebody in to solve a problem, I don't see why not, as long as it's not opening the door. But as some of us said at the time and feared, Labour opened a door that then the Tories could march through and say, well, we're only doing what Tony Blair wanted to do, and you all loved Tony Blair, didn't you? And we're doing what he said, and look how well the NHS went under Labour, which it did, with a great deal of money and so on. So I wouldn't say never, but I'd just be very, very careful about things that open the door to future governments who will misinterpret your intentions.
Thank you very much. Right, so now it's your turn. And while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to invite Matthew Taylor to come up here and do the work now. So thank you very much to our panellists for the moment. And over to Matthew.
So this is my punishment for being late, is I've got to do a Q&A with a room full of intelligent people with strong opinions in 4 minutes.
Excellent.
So what I'm going to do is take a round of questions, but they've got to be really brief or very brief points, and I'm going to ask the panel to respond to just one of those questions and one of those points. Now, I've got early notice of a question from Tim Wilson. Where's Tim Wilson? Where? There. Right.
They're all Tim Wilson.
Man with the hand.
So my question's a little bit about the uptake of best practice. We know what to do. Nick Timmins just talked about the sort of the current orthodoxy around that. So it's around integration of care and so on and so forth. And indeed, we all visit or know places where there's really good practice, and they seem to have the right incentives in place. So if we think about Kaiser Permanente, which many in this room will have visited, it's a market-driven system with choice where the doctors get greater profits from managing demand. Or Ribera in Spain, where there's a sort of outcomes-based contract running at 20% lower cost with a 10-year contract in a public system. So my question is, so those are the places where we see good practice happening. What are the things we need to put in place in the NHS to get the uniform uptake of best practice?
Nice, easy question to start off with. Okay, I'm taking this gentleman here.
John Danzig, if the NHS could be launched at a time when this country really was bankrupt, spent, and with food rationing, and if tens of thousands of citizens of other European countries can survive illnesses where in this country they die, can there really be a claim that politicians have a true and robust commitment to the founding principles of the NHS?
I think that might be a rhetorical. I think that might be a rhetorical question, but the panel may want to respond to it. There's a woman there. Wait.
Yeah. My name is Deborah Trenchard. I'm a patient. I am here I want to talk about a totally different perspective.
You have to do it really briefly.
I'll be very brief.
Very brief.
I just wrote this book based on 25 years of experience with the NHS. I agree with Alan Milburn. We need patient empowerment. Patient education is the way to go. Form filling and box ticking drives a wedge between patient and physician. This is called curiosity, an effective way to empower patients. I strongly believe that it is time for people to get up and say, ask not what the NHS can do for you, but what can I do for the NHS? And that is to empower myself.
Very good, thank you. There's someone right at the back of the room. We might have 2 or 3, because these questions don't really seem...
I wonder what the comment is. We've had a prime example of the future, which is the debacle around 111 and the compulsory tendering of all out-of-hours service with respect to that. And if that is an example of the future, I fear for us, and I just wonder if the panel can comment on that. And just in case my colleague from Hackney doesn't get a choice, GPs in Hackney wanted to take back out of hours but were refused and lost their contracts. So I think we want to do it, or many want to do it. We still do it, actually. We still commission, but many are restricted from doing it by the market.
Very good. Okay, and gentleman here.
Hi, Michael MacDonald, Head of Strategy at NHS England. So very opportune for me. I wonder, given the level of political consensus, whether the time's right to do a cross-party deal on the NHS that gives it the space to do proper long-term thinking.
Good luck, mate, Alan, is what Alan whispered to me. So we'll take the guy right in the back row now. Make it brief, we'll have a couple more.
Okay, I'll try and make it brief. I must say, what?
Yeah, it's fine, just...
Okay. I was very sad to hear that there is consensus within the political parties, amongst the political parties, that the direction of travel since 1990 is that the purchaser-provider split is the only way to go. Is that truly held, and do you ever think there will be a time when the purchaser-provider split will be challenged?
Very good, and then we'll finally have the woman there.
Tori Dunn. I'd like to respond to Stephen Dorrell's suggestion, find a problem and solve it. And the problem I'd like to point to is PFIs, which I believe have undermined the finances up and down the country. And I'd like the panel to respond to the suggestion that perhaps the situation is critical enough to warrant compulsory purchasing or renegotiation of PFIs.
Okay, so I think we'll go in the same order that we were at the beginning. So we'll start with who's been renamed. It's like the doctor, isn't it? The doctor. The professor. You applauded that last point. You can just say, I agree with that last point, and we can move on.
PFI stands for Plans for Idiots. It is the most expensive way of keeping capital expenditure off the books that could ever be imagined. I wanted to respond perhaps to something that Alan Milburn said, suggesting that doctors are opposed to change. We have been transforming healthcare under the radar of all these massive structural changes since the beginning of the healthcare. And if you want really good problem finding and problem solving, you ought to leave it to the professionals. Some professionals are scoundrels, I know, but the vast majority actually believe in the covenant with patients and with healthcare, not in a narrowly defined contract. I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you. Alan, pick a point.
So let me respond briefly to that. So I agree with you. And therefore, I presume that you agree with the concept of clinical commissioning groups, because Lansley and the government has put clinicians in charge of budgets, and budgets change things. So hold on, and then let me deal with Tim Wilson's point, which I think is a really important one about best practice. When I was health secretary, Tim, one of the things that I did was ban best practice guides. Okay. And I banned them for this reason. I worked out a very simple thing, that there were hours devoted to writing them, hours devoted to distributing them, and the people who read them were the good ones, okay? And the people who didn't read them were the organizations that were less good, okay? So best practice will not be generated on the basis of somebody coming up with a neat idea, putting it in a publication, and trying to engender some interest. So when you've been to Spain, as you have been recently, or when you look at Kaiser Permanente, why does it work in delivering better outcomes, not for higher cost, but for lower cost? Because the system is financially incentivized to keep people healthy and out of hospital. I'm sick of reading studies which show that 25% of patients in hospital today needlessly are there. I've seen endless studies repeated over the years that say exactly the same thing. The truth is, if you have an incentive structure which drives activity into hospital, guess what? You will have more patients ending up in hospital. So we've got to re-engineer how the financial incentives work such that the system as a whole is geared to improving outcomes, in part by keeping people out of hospital, keeping them healthy, and to Shirley's point, when they need to get out of hospital, there is somewhere there for them that is good and high quality and that they can rely on. Final point, this wasn't something that was raised from the floor, but it is rubbish, Polly, to say that transparency doesn't improve care. You know, Bruce Keogh, who is now the medical director of the National Health Service, did a very brave thing in 2002, where he agreed, as the then president of the British Society of Cardiothoracic Surgeons, to publish the risk-adjusted mortality data for heart surgeons. They'd been collecting it, but they'd never published it. I had a conversation with him, and I said to him, either you're going to publish it or I'm going to publish it. He agreed to publish it. Bruce would say, as a consequence of doing that, that 5,000 patients who would otherwise have died have had their lives saved. That is the power of transparency. And the truth is, the National Health Service, even warts and all, needs more of that, not less.
Can I just I'm going to come to you. No, you can start with your point of information when I come to you in a moment, Polly. Right, Shirley.
Right.
Sorry.
I'll pick out the one that was asked over here, because actually that's something I've always believed in. I've always believed that where you have a public service, which by the nature of things has to have very long terms of existence, not reorganised all the time, but terms where you can count on 10, 20 years for the achievement of greater quality in it, one of them being health, another being education. The disaster of constantly changing ministers, of constantly changing policy, happens inevitably with your elections. The only way around that is on a certain limited number of public services that you actually get a consensus among the parties that they will try to keep it improving and not to constantly change it over, let's say, a period of 2 parliaments, a decade. Without that, you're always going to get some form or another of tinkering. Now, if somebody says, what's the example, I'll give you one. I mean, it may not have been all we wanted, but the fact that the Minister of Health is still the Secretary of State for Health. He doesn't have the complete detailed micro-responsibility he had, but at the end of the day, he's still there. And when you get a mid-staffs or something like that, he is still answerable. He's still the person that has to get up in Parliament and answer the questions from parliamentarians and from patients, to take the point about patient empowerment. You can only do that, essentially, if you have a commitment which covers across party, broadly speaking, to that particular service. Now, given what Stephen Dorrell said about strategy, there's really no reason on earth why we shouldn't be able to reach some kind of agreement about structures. And I believe that's really what the NHS most badly needs. One of the things I look to with Stephen Dorrell's Select Committee is the way in which that Select Committee has time and again produced agreed reports, agreed across all parties, calling for certain changes in the NHS, but changes that will stick. And that's why I actually think there's evidence that that's the way we have to go.
Which is a perfect cue for me to say that every time I go to very often when I go to health policy forums at the moment, I'm asked about Labour's policy for the development of the Health and Wellbeing Board as an instrument, not in its present form, but evolving into an instrument that can promote integration of the different silos of health and care that I described. And my answer is always to say, firstly, of course I endorse Labour's policy. Secondly, I wrote the Select Committee report that advocated it 12 months before Andy Burnham made a speech saying what a good idea it was. And thirdly, that it's building on the Health and Wellbeing Board, which was the creation of Andrew Lansley, who isn't regarded often as a hero for those who are in favour of integration. So it's an example not of the part the electors have a choice to make, and we're not going to close down party politics. But it's not a bad idea if we stop pretending there are differences where there are none. And the evolution of stronger instruments for the development of more integrated care is something where, if you strip through the rhetoric, the parties are actually on the same square. I want to pick up, though, the lady, if I may, on patient empowerment, because that's another area where something that is put in the mouths of a politician creates an immediate, strong anti-reaction through great waves of the professional community. When the politicians talk about patient empowerment, it's thought that they just see a patient as another form of commodity handed round a supermarket. Just reel to a different place. First term medical school, it is conventional wisdom. Indeed, it's part of professional learning and qualification that you can't in the modern world deal with patients without engaging them in helping make decisions, and where the professional informs a choice about the care that patients have for themselves. A modern professional isn't like the what's that guy who used to march around wards? Indeed. Engagement with patients is part of the day-to-day existence, day-to-day life of a modern professional. We have to learn a little nuance around these discussions. Of course it's true that in a tax-funded system, patients, you can't give complete right to choose any available option and send the bill to the taxpayer. Of course, there are choices to be made, but finding ways to engaging patients much more actively in decisions about their own care is part of the way we deliver better care, and it's also part of the answer to some of the other questions that have been raised about how we create innovation and how we drive change in the system. For as long as healthcare is thought of as being because it's tax-funded, a form of state charity, it will be inefficient and it will be poor quality. Engaging patients in decisions is not a political slogan. It's part of good quality care, and the politicians are accountable for this system because they collect the taxes to pay for it. But they and others need to learn a little nuance about this and a number of other things that we've been discussing.
Holly, a point of rebuttal and a point chosen from the floor.
It's not really rebuttal. I think that I misunderstood what I meant. I wasn't against transparency. I've been a passionate supporter of the work of John Yates, on whose shoulders Bruce Keogh stands in terms of transparency. It was his work, pioneering work, that showed the extraordinary different levels, both of productivity and success rates of surgeons. And I've always passionately thought that should be published. But there are unforeseen consequences. One of the consequences, I think, of transparency is less trust, not more. People ought to have more trust because they know more. But quite often, the political effect is the opposite. People actually, once they know things that they perhaps didn't know before, they become more uneasy about services. They know more about the differences in quality. They ask more penetrating questions. Of course, they should be empowered to do all that, but don't assume that means everybody's going to love and trust the NHS more as a result. It has perverse effects. Not a reason for not doing it. Absolutely not. As for politics, did you say we're head of NHS strategy? Head of strategy, NHS England.
You're worried now, aren't you? You're right to be.
You're going to have an awful lot to learn about politics, it seems to me, because there is no way on earth that the NHS has not been, from its first days, when after all the Tories worked completely against it, deeply political, the most political, before you were born. And it is now. We have just been through a reorganisation which is profoundly ideological, and anyone who pretends that it was just a bit of a technical mishmash or yet another pulling on the tiller or an evolution, this wasn't evolution. He started off saying it was revolution, and it was. It was revolution in the sense of breaking it up, fragmenting it, tendering everything out, making everything competition, reducing everything to its smallest components in terms of cost bases. I don't think that that would be the way that most people in Labour, I mean, Alan is slightly sort of, he's got a foot in both camps on this. He doesn't necessarily represent the Labour point of view. You might think, well, there's not much between, say, Alan and Stephen, who are both reasonable chaps, but neither of them totally representative of their party on this matter.
Alas.
You might say, you might say. But what Labour has said that they'll do is, I hope, not another great reorganisation, but they will make the NHS the preferred provider. They will try and tame that competition, not remove it altogether, use it where it seems to be some pressing reason why. But the idea of assuming that private is always best is what has underpinned the Lansley view. And it is competition read in truth and claw. It is a very right-wing agenda. Now, it may be softened and changed and altered in various ways, but that was its driving force. That was its motor. Monitors, imposing of competition on everybody, as if competition were in itself always going to produce the best results. In a sense, you didn't need anything. If you had competition, the perfect market would perfectly provide, was the spirit behind this. They actually believed that, central planning, as done by the NHS, will always fail. The perfect market will always find a way. And that was the magic of the market that inspired this, and that's a deeply different view between Labour and Conservatives.
Well, thank you for that. It says here that I'm supposed to have a vote, but I don't think you had the vote at the beginning, so you don't have to have it. You didn't have the vote. I could have a vote on, do you think the British political system would be better if the three people on my left were running their respective parties? But I'm not going to say that because it would be highly controversial. I just want to thank our panel for participating, to tell you that the materials from tonight's event, video and etc., will be on the RSA and Nuffield websites shortly, and also, and finally, to invite Professor Dame Carol Black to come up to say a few words to close the event.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, mine's the absolutely easiest and quickest job. It's first to say to Matthew, thank you very much for joining us on this evening's panel discussion. So we're delighted to be doing this with you. And secondly, to say thank you for letting us have our Nuffield reception, our summer reception downstairs. Please, will you all join us for a drink down there before you go home? So thank you very much.